Hello, welcome to the Chapter 24 PowerPoints, which is actually a twofer because you're going to get part of Chapter 23 in this as well. Okay, here are the highlights, essentially starting from the Depression all the way through the end of the New Deal. You can peruse that at your own leisure. A couple helpful things here before we get started. One, the Great Depression starts roughly around 1929, Black Tuesday, the stock market crash. 1932, you get FDR, who is elected president. Defeats Hoover in the presidential election. In 1936, FDR is reelected as president. And then by 1938, the New Deal essentially ends. And so you're talking about a very short period of time which the New Deal takes place. The other thing that will be helpful, because Brinkley doesn't actually do it, historians have talked about the New Deal programs, which is an alphabet soup of programs, and you'll soon see for yourself. They can be slotted essentially in three type of categories. So it can be relief, which provides relief for the unemployed, starving people of the United States. Reform, which is a way of building in safeguards so that this doesn't happen again in the future. And recovery, which will help jumpstart the economic recovery from the Great Depression. Okay, so we're going to start with the quiz here. How bad was the Great Depression? A, real bad. B, very bad. C, pretty bad. Or D, hella bad. Or E, all of the above. And the correct answer, of course, is all of the above. Okay, so what caused the Great Depression? One was a lack of diversification. So Brinkley mentions that essentially the economy in the 1920s, a lot of it was dependent on steel and automobile production. I'm sorry, not steel, it was construction and automobile production. But once those two industries begin to slow down, they will also drag down the economy with them. Secondly is the maldistribution of wealth. And this is a fancy way of saying that the very few rich people have a lot of money and a lot of the very poor people have very little money. Okay, and of course, when you have that, poor people, if there's more poor people, they can't go out to eat, they can't go shopping, they can't go to the movies. And so therefore, eventually it's going to drag down the economy. Third reason is declining exports. And so because the rest of the world is also experiencing essentially their version of the Great Depression, they're unable to buy American goods. If you remember, Germany's busy paying off Great Britain and France for reparations for World War I, as well as Great Britain and France then paying back the US for the money it borrowed during World War I. So they're unable to borrow money. And that actually kind of ties in with that fourth point, the unstable international debt structure. You'll see that because Germany has to pay back Great Britain and France, and Great Britain and France have to pay back the United States, and because Wilson is unwilling to forgive the debts, at one point we will actually have to prop up Germany by giving her a $200 million loan, which kind of just cycles all the way back around. So, can't stress this enough. Black Tuesday is the stock market crash, and so that helps trigger the Great Depression. But essentially, those underlying factors were always there, and so this helped start the Great Depression. It didn't cause the Great Depression. Okay, and what happens once the Great Depression is underway? The banking system collapses, and the banking system is important for this country because essentially it is the oil that keeps the economy humming. And so once the banks begin to collapse, the economy comes grinding to a halt. So how bad was the Depression? You have Hoovervilles, and so people that were displaced from their homes, that lose their homes, they would create tent cities out in parks. They would fashion together shelters from cardboard and whatever other scraps they could find, and they were called Hoovervilles. And so there's a number of digs at Hoover, and essentially he got the blame for the Great Depression, although it's not really his fault, but it is his problem. You know, your pants pockets turned inside out were called Hoover flags. People lived in Hoovervilles. You know, if you eat some nasty squirrels, I think, Hoover pigs. So it was bad. The bonus army should remind you of, it is kind of like Coxey's army. So if you remember Coxey's army during the panics in the late 1800s, the bonus army is similar, that there were World War I veterans that were promised a $1,000 bonus, and they to deal with the Depression, they wanted their bonus early. And so a number of them, thousands of them, actually went to Washington, D.C. They set up camp on the Anacostia Flats. And eventually they were driven out by General Douglas MacArthur under the orders of President Wilson. And it's just a kind of a bad look. And so when you're, it was bad enough with Coxey's army, but now you're driving out World War I veterans. And so that looks bad. Um, President Hoover's a lame duck, okay? And for you non-political types, a lame duck politically is somebody that is not going to serve again. Either that's the end of their term, and they're not going to be reelected, and so that is essentially President Hoover. And so, as a lame duck, what that means is that people don't really need to listen to you. So, they want to dismiss you, call you stupid. They can because they know you're not going to be there. So, anything President Hoover might have suggested made it more difficult because nobody took him seriously because he wasn't going to be in office soon enough. Okay, so how bad was it? 25% unemployment. And just to give you a comparison, full employment today, and really back then, is 4 to 6%. So our target rate is always 4 to 6%. I think right now we're just about under 4%. So here you're talking about 25%. One out of every 4 people that want to work cannot find work. Okay, and that's again the recipe for revolution. Again, we're talking about banks failing. So 10,000 banks failed, 80% of all banks. Again, without the banks there, that really grinds the economy to a halt. And what happens, because the banks are failing, people run to the bank to pull out their money. And if you've ever seen It's a Wonderful Life, with the bank run, because if you didn't get your money out before the bank closed, you would lose your money. Okay, and so people got nervous, stopped putting their money in banks, and because people aren't putting their money in banks, the banks are going out of business. Okay, the social side of the Great Depression, family life's disrupted. You'll read in the 8x11 that you have for this unit. Some of this, just the social hierarchy or the family hierarchies. And so dad is again supposed to bring home the bagels. Mom's supposed to be at home. Kids are supposed to listen to their parents. There's a story in the 8x11 where the son is, or the dad's telling the son to do something, and the son says, "Why should I listen to you? I make more money than you do." Dad's kind of like, "Yeah, you're right," and goes to his room and shuts the door. Okay. One of the perverse things about the Great Depression is that farmers actually let the food rot in the fields because they would actually lose money by harvesting the crops and taking them to market. They would just let it rot in the field. They would dump milk in the highways. And what happened is the only way you could drive up prices is by cutting the supply. And so how do you cut supplies? You let it rot in the fields. And what made that perverse, particularly, is because there's people starving the cities. And so you have people starving the cities, but you have crops rotting in the fields. And some of you guys are probably asking, like, why not let the people eat? Because if you give the people the crops, then they won't buy food at the grocery stores or at the market, and thereby driving down demand further. Okay, suicide rates up, so people are giving up hope and then killing themselves. And probably just one of the strange things that you have young men riding the rails, and it's exactly like what it sounds like. If you have nothing to do, literally, you hop on a train and you ride it somewhere, and then you get off and hop back on and you ride it back home. So that's how bad the depression was. People will stop socializing; they didn't go out anymore, too embarrassed to tell people about their situation, even though many people are undergoing the similar situations. Okay, so what did Hoover do with the response to all this? Again, and part of the problem is Hoover has a good reputation coming into the Great Depression. The problem is this is unprecedented. And because it's unprecedented, he kind of defers to the old way of doing things. And so he is big on personal responsibility. And so he believes that it is charities' responsibility, local charities, maybe state government's responsibility to help those people that have lost their jobs and are losing their homes. He's afraid that the government, if it gives people handouts, they'll become dependent. It'll erode their spirit, their willingness to work. And this is really the same debate we have today about welfare. If you give people something for nothing, are you going to make them lazy and dependent? Hoover believed in a balanced budget. And so normally what a household would do is if you're losing money, if your mom or dad loses their job, you don't spend more money, you would actually cut back, right? Stop going out to eat, stop going to the movies, stop buying new clothes, no more vacations. And Hoover thought the federal government should behave in the same way. So we should have a balanced budget because we have less money. One of the brainchilds that someone in the Republican Party had here is we need to get people to buy more American goods and crops. And so why don't we pass a tariff that taxes foreign goods? Because if foreign goods are more expensive, they're more likely to buy American, which does make sense. However, it also means that European countries will tax American goods, and because they're taxing American goods, they're going to be more expensive. So essentially, what we really helped spiral the rest of the world into the Great Depression. Last but not least, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This is an example of Hoover doing too little too late. And so by the time he kind of came around that he was willing to loan money to banks, to businesses, um, to help them get back on their feet, it was too little. And so they didn't allocate enough money, and the money they did allocate didn't get spent. So it wasn't really helpful. And on top of that, people criticized Hoover because he is willing to give money to businesses, and actually there's another act, the Agricultural Marketing Act, which he's willing to give money to farmers to feed their livestock, to feed pigs and cows and whatever, but he's not willing to give money to people. Okay, and that's what makes it look bad, because here you are willing to help businesses, not willing to help, you know, John Doe. So all this is kind of summed up here in the New Yorker, famous cover magazine. Hoover's all smiles on the inaugural parade, getting ready to get sworn in. Hoover is glum. Okay, and this funny thing, well, kind of funny but sad. Hoover, after he lost the election, he spent time trying to get FDR to support his policies. FDR kept kind of blowing him off, saying, "Nah, we'll see." Um, but Roosevelt, wins in a landslide, wins 50%, 57% of the popular vote, so he's now president. Okay, and so the funny part about FDR is that before this, he was thought of as intellectual lightweight. He was kind of a playboy of the family, not very serious. Um, didn't really have an idea for how to solve the Great Depression. And so his genius was, he said, we're gonna do bold, persistent experimentation. And what that really means is just, hey, we're gonna try a bunch of different things. If it works, then we'll stay with it. If it doesn't work, then we'll stop it. Okay. And he said, we're going to fight the depression like a war. And this is key idea too. Essentially in a war, you wouldn't say, well, we might run out of money or we might have a lot of debt. We better not spend it because, if you lose the war, obviously you're done with anyways. Same thing here. If we don't defeat the Great Depression, we're going to be done with. So we should fight it like a war. Um, to his credit, what FDR does bring to the table, though, is hope and confidence. And so in the picture on the right, you can see President Roosevelt is actually one of the first guys to use the fireside or use the radio as a medium to communicate with the public. So he has these fireside chats where people feel comforted by his voice, because here, the reports were that here's somebody that understands them, can explain to them what's going on in language they understand, and they're comforted in that. So radio, again, is the new medium of entertainment. Roosevelt uses it to reach out to the public, much like I think kind of how President Trump now uses Twitter to reach out to the American public and his followers. Okay, so we have nothing to fear, but fear itself is in his inaugural address. And, it's kind of like, if you remember Hoover, I mentioned this, Hoover thought the Great Depression was psychological. In some degree, he was right. So if you are worried you're going to lose your job, you're going to stop spending money, which only makes things worse. If you can convince people that better times are around the corner, then they're going to go out and spend money, and that would help the recovery. Okay, so we mentioned the banks were the biggest problems, and so that was the first thing that Roosevelt needed to tackle. And so what he did is he declared a bank holiday, or Congress passed a bank holiday. So they were going to shut down all banks for 4 days. The government would go in there and inspect the banks and make sure they're solvent, that they had enough money to operate. And then afterwards, the solvent banks would open up, and you, as the American public, could be confident that this bank was going to last, and you didn't have to worry about putting your money in. And it worked exactly like it was supposed to. Roosevelt goes on radio and explains to the public what the bank holiday is all about. And after the banks reopened, people actually rushed back to put their money back into the banks, which is going to help the economy. And by the way, the prohibitions were repealed. Okay, so what did Roosevelt do to help things get better? It starts with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, AAA. Help you remember this. This is kind of like carrots growing out of the ground, except for it's kind of like an upside down carrot. So anyways, Agricultural Adjustment Act, again, this is basic economics. If you cut the supply, you'll help drive our prices. Okay, and so what Roosevelt did to help cut the supply is he paid farmers not to grow crops. Okay, and that was kind of revolution in the idea. So you're going to pay them to leave their fields fallow, cut the number of crops, and that would help drive up prices. Secondly, he helps create the Rural Electrification Administration that helps bring electricity to the rural areas, helps form co-ops. First time. And so the AAA this is part of recovery. So if you remember the relief, reform, recovery, this probably falls under recovery. Okay, second one is the National Industrial Recovery Act. Sorry, that's a little bit misnamed here, which forms the NRA, which is the National Recovery Administration. Essentially, this does what kind of Hoover had suggested with the associationalism. This puts it into code. And so this allows industries to organize. They set production quotas, they set prices, they set wages for for the economy, and the give back to workers, because if they're setting wages, they really can't compete. They can't go someplace to find higher wages. Section 7A encourages union membership. Okay, encourages workers to join unions. And they would actually go around saying Roosevelt wants you to join a union. And that's under the NRA. And so it was all voluntary. The criticism, one of the criticisms was the biggest businesses tend to dominate the code writing. But businesses that participated, they got to put a blue eagle in the window so they were doing their part to fight the Great Depression. Okay, Tennessee Valley Authority is another program. This one is probably relief/reform, or I'm sorry, relief/recovery. They build a series of dams along the rivers. They help provide electricity to the rural areas. They help provide fertilizer. That helps set a yardstick for electricity rates. So how much should companies charge? If the government can produce electricity at this rate, then companies should be able to also be able to produce electricity at that rate and charge the rate. And so what you'll notice about the New Deal is that it's different programs targeting different groups. Okay, so AAA is for farmers, NRA is for businesses and workers. Here we're targeting the rural areas. Okay, and that's the TVA we just talked about. The banks, how do we deal with the banks? The Glass-Steagall Act. So the FDIC, if any of you guys ever go to the bank, they still have this today. They have a little symbol. It's essentially bank insurance. And so now if you put your money in the bank, you don't have to run there and get your money out before it closes. You are guaranteed to get your money that you deposited back, up to $100,000 back then. Okay. And so this is probably more reform. How do we, prevent bank failures in the future and loss of confidence in banks in the future? The FDIC helps do that. The Securities and Exchange Commission regulates Wall Street. One of the problems you had during the 1920s, you had a lot of fraudulent behavior on Wall Street, pyramid schemes, companies lying about how much money they're making, investors that would cheat the system. So you get a bunch of rich guys together, they would drive up the price of stock, and then the average Joe Schmo would see like the price of GM going up, and then he would jump in, and then once enough people jumped in, all the rich people would take their money out, and the average guy is left holding the bag. So the SEC regulates the stock market. Many of you guys have seen The Big Short or Wall Street, or I think probably The Wolf of Wall Street probably has the SEC in there. It's still around today, probably underfunded, but still around. And that's obviously, those two things are probably reformed to make sure they don't happen again. Okay, the growth of federal relief. So the Civil Works Administration, there's a number of thousands of people out there that are willing to work but can't find work. And so what the government essentially does is it creates jobs for those people. And so it gets them building post offices, roads, libraries, government buildings, and it just provides jobs for folks to work at. And so they're willing to work, they just can't find work. Here the government builds work. Okay, and if any of you guys follow the politics of today, not too unlike, some people have suggested a Green New Deal, that we should put people to work building, green energy of the next generation, for the next generation. Okay, the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, that targeted young men 18 to 25. 18 to 25. what happened is they're kind of a burden on their family, so they don't have jobs. You know, they cost money to feed, and so they provided a jobs program for these young men. They would go work in camps, get paid $1 a day, um, and they would work out in the forest or the wilderness. And so they would plant trees, they would clear the brush, they would build, trails, they would dig fire lines in the forest. And so that's how it was kind of a win-win. So we employed these young men and at the same time, um, spruced up our forests here. And both of those things are probably relief. So it's a way of getting people jobs and helping them support their families. Okay, so what we have after 1930 or approaching 1934, so just really 2 years into the New Deal, you have critics of the New Deal. And so from the right, from the conservative aspect, you have the American Liberty League. They're businessmen that think Roosevelt has gone too far in terms of the New Deal program and government involvement in the economy. If you remember, we're coming off laissez-faire in the 1920s, and so they're critical. Another person that's not mentioned here is, we'll call him this Father Charles Coughlin. Okay. And Father Coughlin is from Detroit, actually. If any of you guys have driven down Woodward, the Shrine of the Little Flowers, his church. He used to broadcast from that church. And originally he was a New Deal supporter. And then later he gets on this conspiracy theory that Roosevelt's in league with bankers, and really what you should read that is like kind of some anti-Semitism, that this uh, worldwide conspiracy of Jewish bankers to dominate the world, and he becomes an outspoken critic of Roosevelt. From the liberal side, you have Francis Townsend, and Francis Townsend said one of the big problems is that elderly are suffering. And so what happened before is, if you were elderly, typically your adult children might take care of you, but now with the Great Depression, your adult children can't take care of their own family, let alone their senior citizen parents. Townsend said we can kill two bagels with one stone. And so if we give senior citizens $200 a month with the stipulation they can't work and they have to spend that $200 in that same month, so they can't save it. And so we'd kill two bagels with one stone, because we would drive up the economy because the money would be spent, and we'd also take care of our elderly. Okay. Another critic that he had from the left was Huey Long. Huey Long was a senator from Louisiana and governor of Louisiana, and his plan was the Share Our Wealth Society. Okay. Said every man should be a king. And so incomes, nobody needs over $1 million. This is the 1930s here. Nobody needs over $1 million in income. Nobody needs over $5 million in wealth. And we should tax that at 100%. And we take that money, we redistribute it to the poor. Every garage should have a car. Every pot should have a chicken. Great idea, maybe, but Huey Long is assassinated. Okay, so the second New Deal, and this exists, make sure you understand this. The second New Deal is launched because the Great Depression has persisted. Okay, it hasn't really gone away. Okay, so Roosevelt launches the second New Deal, and so one of the acts is the National Labor Relations Board, which is better known as the Wagner Act. And because then what happened is the NRA was struck down as unconstitutional. Schechter Poultry versus U.S. They said the government doesn't have the power to regulate the economy like that, so that gets struck down, which then also takes 7A with it. And so the Wagner Act makes it easier for unions to organize. Okay. And speaking of unions, this is the split. Some of you guys that came to the review, if you remember this, the AFL was in the business of organizing craft unions. You remember, white, male, skilled. Those people were easier to organize. The problem is work had begun to shift to unskilled work, so steel plants, auto plants. And there's a split, and they actually literally have a fist fight. John Lewis Sachs, the head of the AFL, walks off stage, forms this Congress of Industrial Organizations, and they will organize unskilled workers. Okay, and so unions do well in the 1930s, unlike the 1920s, and so this is part of that pattern back and forth. One of the new tactics they use is the sit-down strike, and so this was in Flint, in Detroit, and other places. What the workers did was they sat in the plants, And so they would sit in the plants knowing that the owners wouldn't come in there because they might damage the equipment. The family members of the workers would be outside picketing. And this is where it's important is that Frank Murphy in Detroit, the governor of Michigan, refused to go in. Okay, so he refused to take action, and you compare that to what governors and presidents did during the late 1800s during the Gilded Age, where they intervened on the behalf of the owners. Governor Frank Murphy of Michigan refused to intervene, and same thing with President FDR. So FDR refuses to, it thinks strike's illegal, but is not willing to do anything about it. And so what happens during the 1930s, organized labor grows quickly. They win roughly 80% of the strikes during that time. Things get settled, and so it's a good time for unions. Okay, so part of the Second New Deal, again, this is probably falls under reform. That Francis Townsend plan of $200 to every senior citizen is such a great plan, the Democrats seal it. Okay, and so make sure you understand, Social Security is not the same thing as the Townsend plan, but it's similar. And so what this would do is it gives a Social Security check to people over 65 or those people that are disabled or children whose parents have passed away. And so it gives them a check, essentially helps take care of unemployment, and it is really modeled off the Townsend plan. And that's what we have today. So what happens is the people that work today are paying for those people that are retired. For instance, I'm paying for the people that are retired. You will pay for my Social Security when I'm retired, and unfortunately, when you're retired, we'll probably run out of money by then. No joke. Okay, another program during the Second New Deal here is we have the WPA. Okay, and your mnemonic device for remembering the WPA is writers, painters, and artists. And so the WPA provided construction jobs, kind of like the CWA. So there's a lot of overlap here in the New Deal. But what the WPA did differently was it utilized the talents of some of the folks. So you think about how much of a waste it would be to have a artist building a post office building, or a painter building a road. And so what they did is they hired writers to go out and, for instance, interview people during the Depression. So a lot of the oral history we have comes from those interviews. They hired painters to paint these murals. If you look, like in the old Plymouth post office, I haven't been in there, so I think it's still there. I'm guessing it's still there. They painted murals on the walls. And then if you Google search them, there's thousands of murals still around the country. Other artists, for example, playwrights and actors, actresses, they would put on plays for the public to come out and see. So if you remember, one of the problems during the Great Depression was people just literally stopped socializing. So now they could go out. Excuse me. So here you can see the telltale part of this graph is this part right here. And so what happens is stock market crash, unemployment grows, New Deal recovery, things get better. And here in 1937, Roosevelt pulls back New Deal spending. There is some concern about how much money we're spending, that it is billions of dollars. He pulls back, and almost immediately after he pulls back, the economy starts going down again. And that becomes part of the problem. They call this the Roosevelt recession. And I'll talk about that in 1 second here. 1936, Roosevelt runs for re-election. He has the opportunity, or people have the opportunity to vote and essentially give judgment. That's what referendum means, give judgment on the job Roosevelt and the Democrats are doing. And it is a thumbs up. He wins 60% of the popular vote. And the electoral alignment, and so listen carefully, who votes for the Democrats now? It's still true today. So it is union members and working class folks. It is African Americans. It is Southern and Western farmers. It is, of course, liberals and progressives. And so that becomes the backbone of the Democratic Party, still true today as it was back then. Okay, one of Roosevelt's missteps. The Supreme Court had struck down the AAA as well as the NRA. And Roosevelt, under the guise of trying to help the court, the 9 old men it's called, and so he proposes a plan where for every member that is over the age of 70, he will appoint another Supreme Court justice. That plan is rejected by both Democrats and Republicans. And this kind of looks like a power grab by Roosevelt. And so if you remember what's going on in Europe, in their solution to the Depression is to turn to fascism, or in some cases turn to communism. Here it looks like Roosevelt's becoming another fascist. Okay, and so the court packing plan is rejected by both Democrats and Republicans. Retrenchment and recession. Again, the Roosevelt recession of 37 essentially blamed on him, and it kind of raises the question still today: was the recovery because was the recovery due to the money spent and we just didn't spend enough money, or was it kind of a false recovery and it only looked like things were getting better because Roosevelt was spending billions of dollars? Okay, and that's the debate. So key is here by the 1938, we have the end of the New Deal. We start pulling back government spending. Key point for you to understand, the New Deal does not end the Great Depression. World War II, spending for World War II ends the Great Depression. The New Deal probably alleviates the suffering, makes people feel better, but it doesn't end the Great Depression. Okay, that is a major idea. Okay, here's a Supreme Court packing political cartoon, kind of where the Supreme Court justices are a bunch of yes men that are appointed by FDR here. If you look carefully in the trash, you can see the Constitution. This was actually a document, I can't remember SAQ or DBQ a few years ago. Okay, so what does the New Deal mean? One, it changes the role of the government to the broker state. So previously, the United States government was all about building harmony and that we were supposed to be one nation, blah, blah, blah. Now it is a nation of interests. Okay, so we have businesses, we have workers, we have women, we have minorities, unions, and the U.S. government is supposed to kind of be the middleman and all that and kind of let those sides fight it out fairly. African Americans in the New Deal switched to the Democratic side. We've mentioned this already. Roosevelt has this unofficial black cabinet. Okay, if you remember Jackson's kitchen cabinet, which was unofficial advisors of his, same thing here. Roosevelt has a black cabinet that are unofficial, are African Americans that unofficially advise him. Okay. One other thing that's not noted here in the PowerPoint: Eleanor Roosevelt is a outspoken advocate for African Americans. One of the famous events that happened with her. Marian Anderson, an African American singer, was supposed to sing in Constitution Hall. She was banned because the Daughters of the American Revolution didn't want her singing there because she was African American. Eleanor Roosevelt helps hook her up to sing at the Lincoln Memorial, which is a much more prestigious place, and that resonates in the eyes of African Americans. Okay. However, the criticism is the existing discrimination is reinforced. So what that means is AAA actually ends up displacing some black farmers, think sharecroppers, off the land. Social Security doesn't cover domestic workers, which is a lot of African Americans. And New Deal programs such as TVA and CCC were segregated. Okay, and so some of you guys are probably asking, like, why would they support Roosevelt and the Democrats? In the words of one African American that was interviewed, said, "We've never been stupid enough to wait for a whole loaf, when we've been given half a loaf," okay, or something to that effect. So it's been better than any other president before. Okay, for Native Americans, if you remember the last time we talked about Native Americans is the Dawes Severalty Act, late 1800s. That was the act that tried to get Native Americans to assimilate and giving them individual plots of land. The Indian Reorganization Act it does reverse that trend. And so it allows for the public ownership of tribal ownership of land. Some tribes like that, and actually some tribes don't. Okay, for women, symbolic gains, there's Eleanor Roosevelt. Again, she is an active first lady, really probably the first one in history to take an active role. The second one here on the right is Frances Perkins, and she is the first female cabinet secretary. So she's appointed Secretary of Labor. Secretary of Labor, which is important, breaks the ice. However, again, the norms are the prevailing gender norms are buttressed. What that essentially means is women's roles really don't change, and so women were expected to give up their job. If there's a man that was without a job and wanted a job, there shouldn't be any women working. If you go back when you read over the New Deal programs, there's really not any New Deal programs that are targeting women. There are ones targeting farmers and workers and African Americans, not any targeting women. Okay, in the West and South. In the West, let's see, it doesn't really challenge Jim Crow in the South. It accepts segregation. Again, and part of Roosevelt's thinking is he's trying to get out of the Great Depression. He's not trying to combat racism. He does look out for African Americans, but he's not taking on racism directly. The New Deal legacy in the West is essentially that we build a lot of dams and public projects and bring electricity out west as well. I already mentioned this. It doesn't end the Great Depression, but it does make people feel better. Okay. Um, what happens? These last 2 points are kind of the same. The government takes on a new role, and so now the government is responsible for the well-being of all of its citizens. And so prior to this, if you failed, it was a personal shortcoming of yours, and that's part of why people were embarrassed. And like if you couldn't put food on the table, you couldn't bring home the bagels, people would be embarrassed. But now when still true today, we look to the government to ensure the well-being of all of its citizens. So when there's a natural disaster, when there's hurricanes or wildfires or a terrorist attack, or even the economy going down, we expect the government to do something about it, not just to kind of let it ride. Okay, and what that gives us then is this idea, and this is probably still true today. Once the government gives people something like Social Security or Medicare, people expect it, and they feel entitled to it. So now when you try to take it away, they resist. Okay, and that is one of the I don't know, criticisms of government programs, is that once they are giving something, then they feel like they're supposed to have it, like they're entitled to it. Okay,